Chapter 22, October 9th. This weekend left the whole family rattled. Nolan's heart rate dropped, and Foster and Mike had a supervised visit with their father. By Sunday night, Pat was frazzled, the twins were out of control, and Jake wouldn't even come out of his room. If only I could do more. If only, if only, if only. I'm so sick of those words. I want to scratch them out until I put a hole in the paper. I want to change them, rewrite my past, present, and future. I want to write 1,000 times. No more mistakes. No more regrets. No more hiding. No more shame. I strengthened Nolan's heart, gave him a shot of the energy of creation. His body responded, but he still didn't wake up. His brain is damaged from the head injury. I've no training, and the brain is so complicated. I am not ready to risk Nolan's life to experiment on him. I'll have to try other things first, build up to this, even if it means I risk being seen. Is that what I'm really afraid of? Was that what I was afraid of the night I ran away? Afraid that if Mom saw me crying, she'd be disappointed? Afraid to look into the face of a stranger that wanted to take me away? I don't remember. There are several pieces missing in my memory, but I do remember running. The feel of the branches against my cheek, the wet dew soaking through my slippers. I ran all the way to the road between the forest and the park where my brother and I used to play. I never crossed the road without him, and so when I reached the last tree before the asphalt, I stopped. I leaned against the trunk and sunk down to the ground. The cold seeped through my thin pajamas, and I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself. All I could think about was being taken away. Mom and Dad giving up on me. Was it my fault? Hadn't I trained hard enough? Hadn't I learned their lessons and listened to the stories? It was all so unfair. I remember the dark night feeling deeper than usual. The wind picked up and the branches began to sway, reaching out for me. There were movements in the shadows, and even though I was a descendant with the knowledge and energy of creation, I was only 7, and I was afraid and confused and angry all at the same time. I started to cry before I realized I wasn't alone. Gabriel Tuor. Gabe leaned against his motorcycle on a deserted dirt road. His headlight revealed a field of drying hay with a single gnarled tree as the only distinguishing landmark. Everything else along the road looked exactly the same, row after row of freshly cut hay, occasionally interrupted by a barbed wire fence. Now he waited. Abigail's voice reached him again, repeating the directions. He nodded once, sending his reply. He climbed back on his motorcycle and shot down the road. The roar of his engine shook the lone tree as he whipped by. He followed her directions precisely, turning on a single tire trail nearly hidden between 2 barbed wire fences. He followed the trail for several minutes and began to worry he was on the wrong path. Then he saw a single light in the distance, a porch light that shone from a very remote farmhouse. It was on. A good sign. He pushed the throttle, and the motorcycle approached a dangerous speed. Poles in the barbed wire fence passed by less than an inch from his handlebars, blurred until they looked like a solid wall. The fences dropped away. He entered a very pleasant-looking backyard. He hit the brakes, his wheels tearing up grass as he turned around a swing set and drove through a homemade volleyball court. When he passed the back patio, he hit the brakes again and skidded to a stop in a gravel driveway, throwing up a spray of rocks. The rocks peppered a dark car. A man emerging from the passenger's side. He was a tall man, dressed in a black business suit. He was unusually thin, and his bony fingers flew up to protect his face from the flying rocks. The rocks stopped and disintegrated before hitting the man, while the others plinked against the car and ground all around him. Gabe shut off the bike and stepped off, facing Caden Bachman, the man who stole everything from him. Gabe pulled his 2 double-edged swords from their sheaths on his back and held them out in front of him. "You've been waiting a long time for this, haven't you?" Caden didn't move into a defensive position. Instead, he raised his arms, palms in front of him. "But I'm afraid you're going to have to wait a little longer." Gabe bent his knees, preparing to spring, when Abigail's voice penetrated his mind. "They are there, hundreds of them. Get out, get out." Caden Bachman paused as he turned to open his car door. He stopped to watch Gabe with a renewed interest. "You have a watcher." It was a statement. His hungry stare chilled Gabe's insides. He knew what he had to do, but the hate filled his mouth with a bitter taste. He couldn't just walk away. He'd been searching for this man for 20 years, and his goal was standing less than 5 feet away. He had to finish this now. Gabe raised his swords, but Abigail's voice cut through. "The Unguarded is still there. I can see them. Do you have them? There are so many. It's like a black blob on the map. Why aren't you moving?" They hadn't taken the Unguarded. It was either Caden or the girl he'd come for. He couldn't leave another one to disappear. He swallowed his anger with difficulty and turned to bound up the front steps. The car door shut behind him, and he heard the car pull away, wheels crunching on the gravel like mocking laughter in his ears. He grabbed the door handle at the same time as he heard the creatures approaching. Abigail was right. There were far more than 4. It sounded like 100. He turned as the snarling creatures gathered around the circle of the driveway, the porch light illuminated. Their primal growls and the sound of their claws scratching the ground filled the air with a horrible noise. He heard a sound from behind the door, but he couldn't bring an Unguarded out into this. They were safer in the house. He turned and walked back down the porch steps, standing in the center of the manic horde, his swords extended to either side. The first foolish creature jumped at him, mouth distorted, jaw hanging agape, exposing long, sharp teeth. Its shorter front legs were equipped with blackened claws, dripping with poison. Its rear legs were beefy, designed for power, and it used these to propel its slimy body at Gabe. He beheaded the creature with a single swipe of his sword, stepping to the side in the same motion. The momentum of the beast carried its body past him. The Fenris skidded, headless, to a stop at the feet of his numerous companions. The growls fell silent, the moment marked by an eerie stillness as the Fenris regarded their disintegrating counterpart. Using the distraction to his advantage, Gabe drew both hands together, swords pointed to the sky, and with a cry of anger he crouched down, smashing both handles of his swords into the ground. Gabe felt the impact wave with his energy. The ground sunk under the swords and then bulged upward, rippling out from the impact point. The driveway surged like a wave toward the creatures surrounding him. By the time the ripple reached the deformed animals, it was over a foot high. The Fenris were thrown off their feet, landing in heaps, scrambling to regain control. Gabe attacked after the second wave. He dropped 4 more heads to the ground and proceeded to swing both his swords in a blur of deadly metal that glowed green in the dark night. The creatures attacked as they regained their balance. Gabe sent one creature flying with an elbow to its chin. He brought down the sword in the same hand to cut another creature in half. His other sword arm twisted in a low arc, cutting off the paws of 3 creatures in succession. He spun away from the reaching claws of another Fenris while thrusting his sword through the belly of one of the creatures that had climbed on top of its companions, attempting an aerial assault. The creature fell to the ground with a shrill cry, whining bark, and then dissipated into black dust. Fenris were not smart. They attacked and fed on instinct. Strategy usually won the day, unless the Fenris attacked with overwhelming force. Each time Gabe disintegrated one warped demon essence, 3 more Fenris replaced it. One darted low along the ground, and Gabe knew that he would be too late. The long, poisoned claws managed to rip into his calf before he could bring his sword straight down, piercing through the skull and into its brain. He continued to fight, not for victory, but with a manic passion to bring down as many as possible before he was overwhelmed. He would die without ever finding his lost descendant. His frustration gave him a burst of energy, and he cut through several more creatures, spinning his swords with blurring speed. A Fenris jumped at his back and left 3 dark streaks across his cheek as he turned to destroy it. Gabe could feel the burning as the poison ate at his skin, and the blood began to run down his neck. He knocked the creature off his back and stabbed it through the heart. It was a useless battle. He looked up and saw an extra-large Fenris flying through the air, straight at his face. "I failed." The thought was familiar to him, and the acceptance came with sadness and relief. At least the war would be over for him. The constant grief and consuming guilt would finally be gone. He pulled his sword from the disintegrating body and swung it up toward the pouncing creature, knowing it would not save him. He noticed a movement to his side, but remained focused on his doom. Just before the creature reached him, there was a loud thud, and the Fenris stopped mid-air. its face smashed up against an invisible surface. There was a cracking sound as the rest of the Fenris's momentum carried the creature's powerful haunches into its head, snapping its neck. The Fenris dissipated as it slid down an apparently smooth surface. Gabe paused mid-swing as his mind tried to understand the unexplained phenomenon. He turned to see a young girl, maybe 11 or 12, standing beside him. Her arms were stretched out to either side, trembling under some invisible pressure. Her long blonde hair was pulled into a single braid down her back, the bangs plastered to her head with sweat. She looked up at him with an excited grin, despite her obvious strain. "They promised you would come," she said. They were surrounded by a very small perimeter, a circular area with the two of them on the inside and the Fenris snarling and growling on the outside, meeting an invisible solid surface whenever they tried to attack. Gabe's ears rang with the dull thuds of their bodies against the barrier. He looked to the girl for an explanation. "I'm an elemental." She had a strong southern twang. "I can rearrange atoms at an atomic level, so I made bulletproof glass." Her face shone with pride. "Where are your parents?" Her smile faded. "My parents are both ordinaries. I had a feeling and asked them to go to the store for me so they would be out of the way. At least they aren't around to see what these dogs are doing to their yard." One Fenris tired of banging its head against the glass. It jumped in a high arc and hit the glass several feet above Gabe's head. A long, thin crack appeared. "It gets weaker the farther away I am from it. It doesn't go much higher than that." She shrugged apologetically. "Can you move it?" They only had a few precious seconds left. She nodded. "Walk that way. We need to get to the bike." Another creature jumped. This time, the crack spread out in a web pattern, reaching halfway around the glass. "Move." The girl obeyed, walking as if she carried a great weight. Gabe sheathed one of his swords and placed a hand on her back for support. He could see his bike 3 creatures away. He tried not to push her, but it was difficult to be patient with their slow progress. A third Fenris jumped, hitting the other side of the circle. The weakened glass shattered at the top, sending a shower of glittering shards down on their heads. They were almost there. "Drop the glass. Can you cut it in pieces and push it out?" She nodded again. Gabe saw vertical cuts form, dividing the circle into 4 parts. The pieces fell outward, landing on top of the closest creatures. He picked up the girl and jumped on top of the glass in front of them. The curved glass created a path over the last 2 creatures to his bike. He jumped on, setting the girl in front of him while slicing through the belly of a creature with a sword in his left hand. He sheathed the sword and started the engine. The bike roared to life. The back tire peeled out and then gripped the ground, sending the bike flying forward. One last creature made a jump for the girl. Gabe leaned forward to protect her and received a deep cut to his upper shoulder. Then they were free, leaving the Fenris snarling behind them in frustration. "How far to the nearest city?" He spoke the words and manipulated the sound waves to reach her ear. She yelled back. The words would have been drowned out by the sound of the engine, but he concentrated on the sound waves and redirected them toward his ear. 45 minutes to Atchison by truck, but that isn't quite a city. My family thought it would be safer if we stayed off the beaten track." There was nothing around them but farmland, no more porch lights, no other sign of civilization. Many descendants who hadn't joined the Vale thought finding a low-population area would make them safer. It was about as effective as hiding in a sea of people. "I guess it didn't work." The girl's shoulders deflated slightly. "It worked well enough. I have a safe place for you." There was a moment where the only sound was the motor thundering its way through the dark, but the sound felt strange, almost silent. Then he realized why. He hadn't heard from Abigail since before the attack. He sent a pulse. There was no response. When the second attempt was left unanswered, he said her name out loud. "Abigail." She responded a few seconds later, her voice shaking. "You're alive. You made it out." Her voice resonated with an unusually high pitch. "What is it?" He heard her break down into sobs. "Something's happened to Treadon.